Hello, and welcome to The Square Window, the podcast that rewinds time to take us back on a nostalgic trip to the golden age of kids' TV shows. I'm Gareth, and I'll be your host. I've been a professional animator for almost 3 decades and a cartoon fan all my life. I 100% attribute my love of TV as a kid to my career path as an adult, and I want to share my passion for these shows with as wide an audience as possible. So my guest on this episode is Ben Mitchell. Ben is a Bristol-based animator, director and writer. As an animator, he's produced work for CBeebies, Channel 4, Plimp Toons and A Productions, to name a few. As an independent director, he's created 6 short animated films that have been screened for 200 plus festivals and touring programs around the world. As an animation industry writer and researcher, Ben is the editor-in-chief of the UK-based magazine site Squiggly. He's also worked with and alongside a number of international industry events, including Animated Zagreb, Manchester Animation Festival and the recent Bristol Encounters. Ben's choice of show to talk about today is the Real Ghostbusters, the classic American series based on the blockbuster movie franchise. So join us both as we take a trip through the Square Window. Thank you for coming on the show, Ben. Everybody has a soft spot for this one.
It's an interesting show from a production standpoint. There's some interesting sort of little factoids and unusual circumstances behind it, certainly.
Yeah, 100%. Because obviously, I've been wanting to have a little catch up with the show before we talk about it. And I would definitely say it's been a good couple of years. I remember couple of years ago, my kids were really massively into anything Halloween related, witches, goblins, anything. And I remember searching through YouTube to find an episode. And I think they must be like 4 or 5 or whatever. And I reckon I had them for maybe 20 minutes of the first episode, and then they were gone. But I just remember just sort of locked in, peeling through like 3 or 4 episodes of it, and just it coming back as to how much I liked the show as a kid. And
Yeah.
I don't know about how you feel about it, but I think it's aged quite well in terms of production and.
Well, I mean, I've gone on record as finding it a bit patchy. I did an article for Squiggly a long time ago now. I did a sort of mini series of articles, kind of a similar vein to this podcast, of looking back at shows that I watched as a kid and how they held up. And the idea was they were mostly going to be terrible shows. And there actually weren't that many that were bad, so it became easy to just write about old shows that I happen to still have retained some information about. But one of the others, for example, was a very short-lived attempt to make an animated cartoon of Little Shop of Horrors.
Oh, that's funny.
Which was so atrocious. It's all on YouTube now. Some archivist found it. And it's like Little Shop of Horrors, but they took away all the horror. It's just like a kid and his friend who's a plant that doesn't sing R&B. He kind of raps his way through and they solve problems together and they team up and create mischief.
I wanna go to the little shop. Take me to the little shop.
There's no murder, there's no cannibalism or, feeding humans to a plant.
Best bits of the film.
And so Ghostbusters is like, well, there's a lot of deep-rooted, ingrained nostalgia. And, when we were talking about possible things to talk about, thinking of things that immediately came to mind that were more directly influential, it was things that came a bit later, like Ren and Stimpy, Simpsons, or, Looney Tunes, I suppose, much earlier. But probably, actually, this one is a very significant formative influence. It probably isn't a coincidence that most of the animated shorts that I've made have ghosts in them
Awesome.
or some kind of supernatural element. Certainly, I think the creativity that went into it, the designs of all the monsters
Mm.
and things like that, um, they were quite well researched. They kind of go into sort of historical, actual sort of instances of ghosts in literature and folklore and that sort of thing. Um, A for effort all around. I just in general, I have a kind of something kind of happens, I think, or happened to me getting older where the vibe or the general kind of tone and rhythm of 80s animation, like show animation, it just became harder to watch. I would sort of level this against pretty much any show that would have been made
Yeah.
around that time. There's a slightly stilted atmosphere, and there are some things I don't know if we'll draw upon them. I did make a few little notes, and some of them will be kind of similar points that I made in the article all those years ago, but, my theories perhaps as to why that was. But I was also wondering about, like, the sort of cultural impact of it,
Mm.
and, preparing for this and kinda doing a similar thing, kinda watching some old episodes and looking up information on it. That then skewed my algo, so because everything listens to everything else.
Mm.
So I've been getting these Ghostbusters-y things on my, like, social media,
Yeah.
and it's been really interesting how alive and, interested there is a fan base still there. It's a lot of people my age, you know, um, but they're still talking about the toys,
Yeah.
and toys are being remade, I guess. They're getting, they found the old molds and they're repackaging
Yeah.
them and making them again for the middle-aged market. I imagine that's probably more the market than the new the current sort of generation of
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah.
Um,
Because I think we'll definitely have to touch. There's such symbiosis between the cartoon and the films. We'll definitely be touching on the
mm,
films and obviously the newer films as well. Um, but I totally get what you're saying about rewatching 80s shows and the show. Like I've watched the last couple of weeks. I've been watching quite a few now, and just catching whenever I can on YouTube or if I've got something on DVD. And do you think maybe being an animator and learning animation has any impact on how you feel about those cartoons?
100% all cartoons. Like, even, stuff that is really, really strong,
Hmm.
I will always now have this kind of extra layer of sight that I apply to, watching animation. Less so, I think, with stop motion because I've
Yeah.
never been in the weeds of it. I've done visual effects for stop motion, but I've never actually, done puppet
Mm.
animation. So that still has a bit of magic to
Yes,
it.
and yeah, totally.
Um, until some visual effects happen, and then it takes me right out of it because I'm thinking of like, After Effects pipelines and whatnot, matting. But yeah, 2D animation, certainly I'm watching the process, and that does take over.
Yeah.
And it helps, I think, watching certain newer films that wouldn't be that interesting to me otherwise. I can enjoy them in a sort of analytical sense.
Mm.
Uh, we've been on a bit of a Disney Plus kick recently because a friend of my wife's lent us the password. They were staying with us, so catching up on a lot of Disney films that I hadn't watched, and yeah, they're generally not that good. Like, they're great for some people, but, like, to me, yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm watching them with a kinda, like, technical eye. I'm like, "Oh, this is still actually kind of a worthwhile viewing experience, even if I'm not engaging with the story." Um, and I think with a show like The Real Ghostbusters, it is you're watching it more out of technical curiosity,
Mhm.
and you're seeing things, and I think I attribute the stiltedness my theory, and this sort of comes from reading a bit about the production of it and watching a bit of stuff like, uh, on DVD. It came out on DVD a long time ago, and I never made my way through the DVD because they made something like 200 episodes, and the sort of nature of being a big fan of something back in the day, you didn't watch every episode.
Yeah.
You'd like tape it occasionally and you'd dip into it.
Yeah.
And you could be a big fan, but like you didn't binge it in the way you do now with shows. So I did sort of attempt to kind of give it a proper like watch through in my like 20s when it came out on DVD, and like, yeah, this is not gonna happen. Like, you know, you can do it in dribs and drabs kind of thing, but I was more interested in the sort of stories about making it and adapting the premise from the movie to the show.
Yeah.
But something that came up in one of the sort of DVD featurettes is different production departments, or different like departments, I guess, of the show kind of crediting themselves as the director.
Right.
So the writers are like, oh, we have the most control. So we're kind of the director because we come up with the whole story and we have the directions in our scripts. But the directions aren't really being actioned efficiently. I would assume the writers aren't present to kind of give feedback as production kind of begins proper and is outsourced to Japan or whatnot. The voice director credits himself as the director because, well, they're directing the performances of the actors, so that's basically directing the storyboard artists, etc., etc. Like, so what I'm piecing together is these are cartoons that don't have a director.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
So that, I think, is kind of what happens is people are sort of, they all have their own agenda as far as what the vibe of the show is going to be, but it doesn't coalesce, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Like
Sure.
as a watcher, there is an animation director, who, but there's a documentary, an old documentary that was made sort of when it was coming out, where they talked to the animation director, and he's talking about it in a much more kind of technical thing of like, I'm making sure we're not doing anything wrong. I'm making sure this framing is feasible. I'm making sure there's continuity. And having worked on shows with directors, and I expect this is the same for you, it's a very specific discipline.
Yeah.
So I was doing some segments for Sesame Street a couple of years ago, and the director on that, she was so perfect for the role because she would direct over Zoom or whatever, you know, across the office from the post-production department. And she would be doing the show, she'd be performing it, she'd be creating the world, and her energy matched the energy of what the cartoon would eventually
Oh.
be. And I think maybe that was a stage that was possibly missing back in the 80s or with
Yeah.
this
Sure.
particular production. I think maybe it was more like people were kind of pulling in their own direction.
Yeah.
Just a theory, but I think that may have been it.
No, it's actually really good theory, and it sort of gels with a lot of stuff that I've read about the production, you know, and that it seems like Columbia, after they made the film and they decided that there was no pressure on them to make a sequel or anything. They had just done really well, but they decided to go down the route of making the animation show, and it seems that they had all the cards when they were in deciding how they wanted to do it. So when they were with the development company and the production company, they were kind of the producer. I can't remember his name. It's something like Michael Gross or something like that. And they just dictated what they wanted. You know, what they wanted. I think there wasn't one of the writers, Michael J. Straczynski from the Babylon 5 guy.
Yeah, I think he sort of helmed part of it. And this is another sort of interesting thing about like how it was kind of conceived. It was made, or there were two separate contracts, I guess. And he was at the helm of one of them. And the other one it was specifically a kind of 13 show order for Saturday mornings.
Right.
But simultaneously, they wanted to get a syndication deal off the bat. So they were trying to sell, I think, like 54 or 65 episodes, I think, specifically to match another show called Ghostbusters that was trying to be sold at the same time. And somehow they got that deal at the same time as the Saturday morning cartoon deal. So they're making two versions of the same show out of the gate. one of them is being shown every day of the week. And that's the version that Straczynski was in charge of. And the other one was a bit more kid-friendly, and that was developed specifically for Saturday morning slots. So I haven't really clocked it, but according to things I've read, there's a bit of a tonal shift between the ones you would watch on Saturday morning and the ones you'd watch during the week in the afternoons, apparently.
That's crazy, because again, that's something that you wouldn't, as a kid, you wouldn't have even noticed. You'd have just,
No.
because you wouldn't, like you said, you wouldn't have binged them, you would have caught them. You know, it might be 2-3 weeks between seeing the next one. But
The idea of having that many shows greenlit, that many episodes, it'd be quite nice.
Yeah.
Nowadays, like,
Yeah.
you know, we're jumping from, you know, log to log in a swamp, looking for work and shows out there. Yeah, I wouldn't mind a show with, you know, 100 episodes to make off the bat.
Very different times in terms of production.
Yeah. Mind you, I think, I mean, it would have been chaotic. And another a quite nice story I read was about like how they kept the animators motivated. They took them out skydiving. Not the animators, but the production team in general. They took them out skydiving to just really ramp up their adrenaline.
Wow.
And so, you know, a couple of them got hurt, but all of them like came down like, you know, like really, really amped up. So they were able to turn in like a week with basically no sleep and really kind of like really make a dent in things.
I don't know if I'd motivate me being thrown at an airplane. So in terms of, so paint us a picture now of how you found the show then, yeah? So, if you don't mind, how old were you when, you know, when the show sort of first broadcast? And like, I know you're from Canada, am I right? So was the broadcast, did you get it before Britain? Because I know obviously America got it about 2 years before we had it. Did you get it before the UK then?
So I think the North American market got it about a year before
Right.
the UK. But I always went to school in England,
Right.
including like nursery school. So
Okay.
I would have first seen it in England, I'm pretty
Right.
sure. I did look it up. It started in 1987 on CITV. So I would have been 3.
Cool.
And it's hard to kind of pinpoint discovering the show because it's embroiled with my first memories of anything.
Awesome.
So it's my first memories of watching television is watching the show, that and like Fraggle Rock and maybe The Muppet Show, you know. And it was, you know, a bit more, probably a lot of it was kind of lost on me. And it seemed like it was my entire world for years and years and years. But by the time, because I remember by the time Ghostbusters 2 came along, I would have swore I'd have been watching the show for like 5 years, but it was probably like a year and a half, max, well, maybe closer to a year. And in that time, I had been shown the first Ghostbusters movie, so I was aware of, you know, the movie version and the cartoon version. But the second movie coming out was such a big deal. It was like such a game-changing like thing of like they make other movies that follow on from movies. Like I didn't know what a sequel was, but it would. So I was talking with Laura about this earlier. Something that kind of, I think, signifies just how much our brains develop so quickly at that age is that when I first started watching the show, I remember being young and stupid enough to think that I could open up the TV and reach in and take out the characters and show them the toys I had of them.
Brilliant.
Because I'd seen it, I think a Looney Tunes or a Disney short like that happening, someone opening his TV and reaching in and strangling the person inside the TV. And I remember like how this light bulb going off at school one day going, oh, when I get home, I should do that. And that, you know, that'll be an interesting interaction, the actual cartoon characters and the action figure. So then my disappointment when I realized there was no hinge at the top of the TV. So that's what a dipshit I was. But then cut to around the time the second movie's come out, which again is like a year later.
I think it was like 89, something like that. No?
Yeah. I thought I would have been 5.
Nice.
By that point, I kind of knew how movies were made, and there was a documentary sort of made around that time about making the Real Ghostbusters, and I remember that being sort of really easy to comprehend. It really explained animation to me, in a very, it just made sense.
Yeah.
And so to go from like, oh, you can reach into a TV and play with the cartoon characters to, oh, animation is a craft that, it involves stages and things like
Yeah.
that, and it's photographed and put together. A lot had happened cognitively. So that I think is basically just to sort of demonstrate just how young I was. Like my brain was like, very rapidly kind of connecting the mechanics of the world. So
That's really interesting because, so obviously the cartoon was your introduction and not the film. So how did you feel then when you, after watching the cartoon for so much and then seeing the film, what were your thoughts then about how, did you prefer the film then, or did you think, oh, it's not as good as the cartoon?
I remember being sort of fascinated by it because I remember our neighbor, Nikki, who was a girl who was a little older than us, and she had, knowing that I liked the cartoon, had rented the movie for me and dropped it over. I don't know if my parents had vetted the movie. I think they were just happy to pop it on. And I remember finding it initially a bit hard to follow and working out who was who, because they, you can relate Egon,
Yeah.
for example, quite well, like, quite easily to the cartoon version. But I did find it odd because like Dan Aykroyd, when in the early 80s, he wasn't skinny, but he was quite slender.
Yeah.
And I always felt that he looked more like Venkman. And Bill Murray has a round face, and so he looked more like Ray in the cartoon. Even though Ray's the sort of chubby character. So I found them kind of confusing because I felt like they should be playing the other, this should be the other way around.
Yeah, 100%.
And there were all sorts of characters that, aren't in the cartoon. Slimer isn't their friend. But I kind of understood it. Like I was aware that it was, it was an origin story. That, chronologically it was meant to take place before the cartoon. This is about how they all come together.
Yeah.
Being very relieved when Winston finally showed up because he's not in it for a long time. And yeah, it was, it was an introduction, I think, to the concept of like an IP, being kind of tweaked and fiddled with. And something that was, I remember feeling sort of validated or or whatever, like watching the documentary, that was made in the 80s about the cartoon, and they talked to Harold Ramis and Dan Aykroyd, and they both comment on how they were also surprised by the differences, in how the characters were sort of portrayed. I think it
Yeah.
was legally something they had to do. They couldn't look like the actors,
Yeah,
but
that's
then they
nice.
was quite surprised. Oh, he's made me blonde, or he's made me ginger. Like, where did that come from?
It's a good point actually, because someone on the Facebook group, Ash Collins, he had the question as to why the characters didn't look like their film counterparts. And I think at the end of the day, it just came down to money, and they just didn't want to deal with the actors' agents, and so they decided to go, we'll give them something that makes them that gives them something. But they were, like you said, other than Egon, there really wasn't anything.
Hmm. I think that, yeah, I don't really remember what the definitive reason was, but I just know that they were told they had to change them. They couldn't be sort of identifiably, Harold Ramis in cartoon form. And there's some nice stuff there's a book actually I got a couple of months ago. So there was another reason why this came to mind as a thing to discuss, and I have it here. It's a very comprehensive book about the production of the show.
Okay.
And I think it came out like this spring. I'll just show it to you. And I just picked it up just because I thought it would be interesting.
Okay.
It's not a review copy. And I've read most of it, and it's not a book for kids.
Right.
in the sense that, like, I think kids would find it really, really boring. I think people who are listening to this podcast would probably like it. It's called Real Ghostbusters: A Visual History
Awesome.
by Troy Benjamin and Craig Goldberg. So any information I have about the show, I'm kind of paraphrasing from this book and a couple of documentaries I've watched. Reading the book, you'll probably get a more accurate version of events. But this cover, this particular piece of art, I'll just sort of bring it a bit closer, try and get the glint off it. But I think everyone who watched this show or was a fan of Ghostbusters at the time knows this image because it was on everything.
Yeah.
And something that was curious about it that sort of struck me as a kid, a couple of things. One is that they're trapping Slimer, who is not a ghost that they trap in the show. He's their friend.
And this must be Slimer.
Skip it, Slimer. She's heard it.
And they don't really look like themselves. They look like kind of beta prototype versions of the characters. And that basically, that's exactly what that was. This was the sort of first piece of concept art that was developed to try and sell the show to various networks for its syndication. So and there were a couple of different versions of this image as well that kind of circulated. And I think it's interesting because that's an image that really endured, but it's not like a final image that's representative of the show. It's rendered in a very painterly, elaborate, detailed way. They all look like they have mascara on for some reason. It's a lovely painting. It's really, and it's very dynamic, and it
is really nice.
It tells a story, and I can see why it was successful as a piece of art to pitch the show. But that in sort of tandem with a kind of 5-minute like music video pilot thing they did.
Yeah.
You can kind of see the progress of. It's a sort of interim thing between the movie versions and the sort of versions in the cartoon. They do look a bit more like the actors from the movie, I think, in that sort of early sort of animation pilot and this piece of art. So it's an interesting thing seeing the process kind of happen in that way. I don't imagine it would be an issue if they were going to do a show based on Ghostbusters now. I think they are actually doing a show based on Ghostbusters at the moment. But I think that maybe people are a bit more sensitive about likeness and depictions and that sort of thing. And this went across a bunch of different like Ghostbusters media. I remember I had a Ghostbusters 2 coloring book where they just like they drew Ghostbusters in scenarios from the films, but they weren't the Ghostbusters at all, and they didn't look like the cartoon versions either. They were just like, they got their neighbor around to sort of pose and like hold a thing. They're like, okay, that's great. But clearly not representative of like any other iteration of the characters. But it's a sort of unfathomable kind of world of like, what's allowed and what isn't. And a story from the book that I got a chuckle out of was the standards and practices battles of they weren't allowed to use the Necromonicon because they weren't allowed to use real occultist literature. They weren't allowed to refer to it. To which the guy is like, well, it's not real. It's made up, you moron. And they were like, no, our mind is made up. And once standards and practices decide you can't do it, you can't do it. So, yeah, all sorts of BS flying around to navigate. So.
Gentlemen, something's here. And it's right over there.
The trailer, the advert for the show on CITV. And obviously it's been a few years between it, but Ghostbusters had picked up such a large audience base, that it was, even though it was a couple of years later, and obviously it took longer for the film to go from cinema to tape to home release. So there was still that popularity in the air. So when the show came out, then it still felt new. It still felt like, oh, I really enjoyed that film. And this is really cool. They don't look like the characters in the film, but it looks good. And then I just remember casting on CITV, and so yeah, if it was 87, I was in 10, and just enjoying it, just really enjoying it. It wasn't up there for me with Masters of the Universe or Transformers, but it's still one that you would look forward to, that you'd want to get home from school to catch.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, I just always found it strange that they didn't look like the characters in the film, and they didn't sound like them either. And that one of them sounded a little bit like Garfield. That was always strange.
Yeah. Yeah. It's because, I mean, now it's something people really kick off about, I think. Like on social media, there'd be like a furore
Oh,
that they
can you
didn't look
imagine?
like the characters. Or like when you think of like how nutso people go about the fucking Last of Us, or Sonic, not looking like he does in the games or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I guess assuming the franchise was big enough, I guess if it was a kind of mid-tier thing, people would be like, whatever. But yeah, it's definitely, I think, a hallmark of the time. I think more than the like you sort of mentioned about like the voices and sort of recognizing them from other things. That was, I think, a real contributor to what worked about it was a sort of chemistry between the sort of, new replacement, voice
Yes.
actors. I think that assortment of voices together, that's still actually very satisfying watching the episodes as an adult. It's sort of like a comfort, that ensemble.
It's like voice
Yeah.
cast royalty, isn't it? If you look back at the actual cast, because
Mm.
they, I forget again when I was watching. I think he mentioned something about Ninja Turtles the other day, but I think they were interviewing Rob Paulson, and he was saying about how there was a small pool of voice cast actors and actresses working around the industry then, and so they would always cross shows. But I mean, Ray was Frank Welker, wasn't it? So I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, you look at his IMDb, and you're scrolling for 10 minutes, and it's everything you know. I mean, because he was Megatron and Fred Jones from Scooby Doo, and just that alone is
Yeah.
crazy.
No problem. He'll show up again.
Anyway, I'm sure he's still going.
Yeah,
Because he's definitely very much still the kind of jobbing, or busy actor. Right up until, I guess I remember like he was in Futurama. I mean, it's a pretty long in the tooth example to pick, but I'm sure he's always been at it.
wasn't he the monkey in Aladdin, the original film?
I think he did a lot of animal voices. I
Yeah,
think that was one of his specialties. I remember hearing about that. Like by and large, if you would hear an animal voice, rather than actually sort of find it on a stock library sound effects tape to have Frank Welker do it. So it's a pretty good skill set, I think, because there's a lot of demand for that, obviously, in animation.
yeah,
Yeah. I think the cast member that endures the most for me, it's got to be Maurice LaMarche as
yeah.
Egon. He is so funny, and like throughout, like I was watching something the other day with him, and it was a new Futurama, which are a bit, but he's in Futurama, plays a bunch of different characters, but they were doing a kind of Squid Game pastiche, and he was playing a sort of version of those terrible English actors in the Squid Game show that they come up with the show's so good until like English speaking actors come into it and they're so dreadful. These sort of like royal people with the masks and whatever.
Opposite.
So he's playing a version of one of those, and it wasn't the best episode in the world, but all of his lines were hilarious. And he's he did Pinky and the Brain. He was the brain.
Yes, he was the brain, wasn't he?
The common thread in all of my failed schemes is human stupidity.
He did in The Critic. which isn't a very well-known show. It's a kind of like Simpsons
John
teen.
Lovitz.
John Lovitz is the film critic.
Yeah.
And Maurice LaMarche plays basically everyone else.
Yeah.
A lot of celebrity impersonations that are bang on, and the scenes where he plays Orson Welles in particular are some of my favorite things in animation. They're like really top of the leaderboard. Every one of the episodes of Ghostbusters I watched the other week, sort of in prep for this, was he was playing a sort of Orson Welles ghost.
Right.
That all the ghost says is Rosebud. But he says it in the same kind of manner that he does in the critic. So just that was funny to me, like by association. But he kind of threw himself into it in a way that I think he was just as much, to me, Egon as Harold Ramis was in the film.
Yeah, sure.
And I think maybe that makes him a bit distinct from the other three.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, like about with Garfield, and it was the same guy who played Garfield.
Yeah.
I thought he was great. I thought he was I really liked, very kind of monotone, but like
Yes.
really brought a certain energy to that character that made it his own. Winston, this is tragic, but the guy who plays Winston in the film didn't get, he auditioned for it.
Didn't he? Ernie Hudson.
I mean, he's got some. I'm glad that he clearly has a big fan base.
Yeah.
But he, I think, got a really raw deal. Like, because I sort of understood him not being in the first half of the first Ghostbusters movie. But if you watch, Ghostbusters 2 does this sneaky thing where he's in like the first scene, and then he's not in the movie again until like halfway through. But because they put him in at the beginning, it's like you feel like he was there the whole time. And I didn't really sort of realize that, but he sort of brought it up in an interview a while ago. I was like, oh yeah, they did do that. So they kind of like shafted him out of the second movie as well, when there was no reason to do that.
But he was, and so yeah, Ernie had an audition, I read, and he didn't get it, and they gave it to Arsenio Hall, the American chat show host, and who's in Coming to America. And apparently the reason they gave it to him is because he was funnier and sillier.
Ouch! You know, I wish you guys would figure out what this thing's supposed to be. If I'm going to be disintegrated, I'd at least like to know by what.
Yeah, it's a cruel business.
The one I love most though is Venkman's voice, because like the whole Garfield thing, and just Lorenzo Music, who also did the voice of Garfield in the cartoon. And apparently Bill Murray, although they didn't have any say in the show itself, he didn't like his voice, and eventually, I think after the second season he got replaced. And his reason, as I said earlier, was that he sounded like Garfield.
Sorry, gentlemen, but my public calls. Perhaps we can continue this later. Ta.
Which then was ironic, because obviously Bill Murray goes and voices Garfield in 2 films later on in his career.
No.
That's like, that's a little bit unfair, but
they must have been so happy when they got him for the Garfield films.
yeah.
Like, that must have been such a punt.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, he said yes. Jesus, okay. There's some weird Peter Venkman Garfield universal connection, because there's those 2 instances. But also, this is a bit of a tangent, but I had a Ghostbusters game for the Game Boy that was absolutely appalling, like a really boring puzzle game. And then like a year later, I got given a Garfield game for the Game Boy. It's the same game.
No way.
It is literally the exact same game, but in one of them, it's a little Peter Venkman sprite, and in the other, it's a little Garfield sprite. But like, and the premise of the game has nothing remotely to do with Garfield or Ghostbusters. You're just solving like puzzles and collecting diamonds and some shit. And it's like, what is the universal cosmic connection that is keeping these 2 characters constantly like entangled?
I don't remember. I think as the show went on for a couple of years, and it definitely went on to the early to mid 90s. And I think I sort of started to lose interest, and I don't remember much of the later shows. But there was like I was looking at the character designs and obviously the difference because the four main characters each had a different color uniform compared to the film where they all had the same one. But looking back at series, Janine, the design of Janine changed. In her design was quite spiky, and she was very much Janine from the first film in the first couple of series, and then
Yeah.
in some of the later shows, she just went softer. She had different hairstyles. She had rounded glasses. Um, she
Different
didn't seem
accent.
as Janine-like.
Oh, you must be Janine Melnitz.
Well, if I must, I must. Though all things considered, I'd rather be Meryl Streep. But then, wouldn't we all?
Yeah. Yeah, they took her away from like Brooklyn, and gave her a kind of, I think they wanted to make a more sort of mother hen kind of character. And I don't know if this is actually real, but I did see something when I mentioned about the Facebook algo.
Yeah.
There was something where it was like posted like a kind of like notes on changing the design of Janine,
Okay.
and it had like sketches and stuff. And one of them was literally make her less slutty. No, I don't know if I'm assuming that was an actual piece of production art. I'm not sure why someone would fabricate that. But I didn't read slutty from the first iteration. But she did wear like, slightly shorter skirts and,
Yeah.
had a bit of an attitude and had fun hair kind of thing, which is interesting because actually in the movie, she's a bit of a frump in the first one. Like I maybe this was more my read as a little kid because she's probably like 21 or something in that first movie, but she always seemed like a bit of an old lady, like someone who'd work at a school.
Yes, yeah. Bastards.
And they kind of, in the second movie, they kind of give her a bit more to do, I
Yeah.
suppose. But yeah, it was an interesting kind of, that all I think kind of, similar to you, I kind of lost interest after the second season, which is sort of a misrepresentative statement insofar as the second season, because of that syndication deal, is something like 80 episodes long. So I did watch a lot of it. But I tapped out probably about the midway point, I suppose, if we would just sort of look at like all the episodes that were made. And the thing that marked me tapping out was definitely the casting changes. Like I don't think it was entirely why I stopped watching it, but I remember like if it was an episode where Peter Venkman didn't sound like Peter Venkman anymore, I wasn't probably going to like it. And so there's a whole kind of era that I was aware of, but I didn't really watch. And I remember sort of when I did the Squiggly article and I watched a few of those later episodes, I don't know if you've seen this, but interestingly, there's one of the last episodes I think they made is an episode about the design changes of Janine throughout the show, and they address it.
Oh, wow.
And they talk about, and they're sort of going through like a photo album. It's like, wait, you're a completely different person here. What's going on? And so they make it a ghost story. They make it like supernatural intervention has happened that has changed her appearance and her voice over the years. Which I thought was kind of a funny way of tackling that.
Really good.
I think most shows would probably just be like, no, don't pay attention to what came before. Yeah.
So I know, speaking to friends and Tet, when I told them the next recording is about the Real Ghostbusters, and there's been a couple who have always wondered why we needed the word real in there. Why the Real Ghostbusters? Are you able to elaborate on that?
I'm pretty sure I know why at this point. I initially, because at the time it was almost like a koan or a riddle of like, well, but surely the movie, the live action movie should be called The Real Ghostbusters, if anything. But the first time I actually sort of heard it laid out properly, I was trying to sell a graphic novel about 10, 15 years ago. at a big comic convention, and I was sort of looking at other vendors and taking a break from, trying to sell mine. And there was a guy who was just selling old comics, he had a comic book shop and was selling them. And there was this poor woman, she was just sort of leafing through, probably trying to find something for her boyfriend. And she picks out a comic that says Ghostbusters, but it's not Ghostbusters, it's a different thing. And I think I mentioned before there was another show trying to get made at the same time called Ghostbusters. So he, for some reason, really registers that she's picked up this comic, and he proceeds to mansplain the history of the warring Ghostbusters. I've never seen a human being less interested in what they were being told. It was actually astonishing. I was sort of watching, a little bit in awe, but also I did kind of want to know because I never really gotten to the bottom of it myself. By the time I would have been able to sleuth it, it wasn't really sort of something that would have occurred to me to look up.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was a Ghostbusters in the 70s that was its own thing. Eventually they make the movie, and I think calling it Ghostbusters was kind of a late production decision.
Right.
And there's footage of in the movie Sigourney Weaver turns on the TV and she sees the advert.
Yeah.
And it's them doing this very kind of amateur advert for the Ghostbusters. So there's footage of them filming that advert, and different takes and outtakes and stuff. And they're going through all sorts of different names for what they're going to be, like Ghost Smashers, Ghost Hunters. And by the time they were already filming the movie, they still hadn't decided what it was going to be called, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And for some reason, the one they alighted on, they would have at some point gotten wind that it was a thing that it shared a title with something else. And they just decided to persevere with it. Litigation be damned.
Yeah.
And so, sure enough, they were like, well, why did you do that kind of thing? So I think were trying to, the original Ghostbusters, which was owned by Filmation, or Filmation was trying to make it into a cartoon. They wanted, I think, to capitalize on the name.
Right.
And initially, I think, wanted to do an animated series based on the movie. And then when they couldn't get that deal, they were like, oh, we'll do the other Ghostbusters. So Columbia, I may be getting some of this wrong,
it's good.
From reading this a couple of weeks ago. Columbia's Ghostbusters were like, oh, you are you? So they then put this pitch deck together, which includes that really nice painting I showed you before, and their premises for how they were going to change the characters and make it really streamlined and merchandisable. And that, of course, sells to a billion territories, and it kind of leaves the other one in the dust. And in this very kind of glib way of well, how do we distinguish ourselves from the pre-existing Ghostbusters? Like, well, which one is the one that is culturally relevant right now?
Yeah.
It's us. We're the real Ghostbusters when people say Ghostbusters. So it's really a passive-aggressive move. It's really salty. But they got away with it. It was fine. No consequences as far as I'm aware. I imagine maybe some hurt feelings, but I guess we brushed it off back then. Did a few lines of something or other.
That's brilliant.
It was the 80s.
Yeah, exactly. I use that excuse all the time. Yeah, it's the 80s. So obviously, series finished. The films are still. I mean, now, obviously, we've had 2 sequels in a sense. The show. I mean, Ghostbusters have never really lost any popularity, and they always threatened to make a film or so over the years, and then finally did. There was a sequel to the show, there wasn't there? There was the Extreme Ghostbusters, which is always a curiosity. I can happily say I don't think I've ever seen an episode of that, but wasn't it about Egon he was the only one of the Ghostbusters still busting ghosts, but he was also like a university lecturer, and so he had younger students helping him or something like that.
I think that was basically the premise. It was a kind of handing over to new characters. I remember that definitely I would occasionally see it on TV, and I was in full pimply Beavis and Butthead teenage cynicism and didn't want to give it the time of day. But I have actually dipped into it since, and it's watchable.
Mm.
I think it was a reasonable effort to kind of, try and maybe stir up some interest in
Yeah,
Ghostbusters
sure.
in the sort of like mid to late 90s. But it has all of the hallmarks of those sort of 90s reboot or injections of, modern modern attitudes and modern trends and things like that. Just the fact that it's called Extreme Ghostbusters. What it is to me, it's kind of like the Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie show of Ghostbusters. It's like, we're Ghostbusters, we're back and we're fucking
Yeah.
extreme.
It's a
Okay, what
very
is that?
90s type, isn't it?
Yeah. What does that constitute? Oh, it's a different font. Jagged edges. But the characters are actually interesting characters. I do remember also like feeling very conscious that it felt a bit like a tick box
Sure.
exercise in diversity, which is now actually something that like it's just part and parcel of everything with animation. It's just a consideration. But at the time, I think in the 90s, it seemed a lot more cynical. In a way that like just having one of the Ghostbusters be a black man
Yeah.
wasn't. Like and I think that was maybe one of the reasons why my parents were, quite happy for me to be a fan of the show, is they had a black friend, a black peer, a black colleague, and they never mention it.
Yes, yeah.
Like it's just he's in every respect they're equal. He gets equal amount of screen time.
Yeah.
And that again is sort of another aspect of going back to the movies that sort of feels a bit like, oh, it's a shame that they didn't have that same attitude toward the character in the movies, because that actually does stand out, I think. But in the 90s show, it was very much, I think, more like a kind of, there was more ethnic representation, but kind of by committee, it felt.
Sure, I get it.
And one of them was a white guy, but he was in a wheelchair.
Right.
And, that's it. I mean, none of this is a negative thing, really.
No, I get that, yeah.
But it did, like I say, it just sort of felt a bit, I don't know, labored, perhaps. Less organic. But it was, I think those types of things where people will, oh, let's dig this out and dust it off and see if there's interest there.
Life,
And I think Ghostbusters really suffered, I think, by the timing of the bringing it back was periodically just a bit off. And I think they could have had more momentum if they had made a third movie in like the early 90s.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Which notoriously Bill Murray didn't want to do.
Yeah.
By some accounts, the script was never that good, or it wasn't very funny. It was more kind of serious, so maybe it's for the best. What was interesting, though, was like you take another 10 years, they made a Ghostbusters game.
Yeah.
And that, like, really, it seemed like it really tapped into something.
Yeah.
People really were, like, thirsty for, like, oh, yeah, Ghostbusters, that was awesome.
For this.
And it's a video game now, brilliant. Like, so that was the timing being perfectly spot on somehow. But it's a strange one to kind of observe, like, periodically, people will kind of, like, dust it off, and sometimes it sort of tracks and sometimes it doesn't. And, the reboot attempt, which I thought was pretty good, but no one really cared, I think, at that point. The whatever, like, enthusiasm people had around the time the game coming out, I think it really kind of waned. I think there are a lot of legitimate criticisms you could level against it.
Yeah.
But they're completely drowned out by these nonsense criticisms. And the very sort of famous, like, misogyny and vitriol that the actors received. And it was really kind of buried, I think, and unreasonably sort of maligned as a film.
Yeah.
I think the fundamental mistake the guy made was that it's not the Ghostbusters. It's sort of 4 different people.
Yeah, totally, yeah. And
I think that
Murray come back and Dan Aykroyd and and the little cameos in there, I thought that was a bit of a mistake, really, because them playing a different character, the first thing I thought was, oh, no, is he pretending to be that character? How are they going to do that in the film? And yeah, I didn't. I found the elements of it when the girls were just riffing off each other. It was really funny, and Chris Hemsworth was funny, but it just wasn't Ghostbusters. It didn't feel like Ghostbusters, And then when they went and did the sequel, but when it was more about the children, and then they sort of turn up at the end again, it just kind of felt a bit. I enjoyed the film, but again, it didn't feel like Ghostbusters, and it felt like that bit at the end was just sort of tacked on. And
Mark Commode reviewing, I think, either the newest one or the one that came a few years before, he kept referring to this specific term he'd come up with because he didn't care for them at all. I don't think he really likes any of them. But his term was unearned nostalgia.
Okay.
That was his big criticism of making a Ghostbusters movie now.
Yeah.
Or a show now or whatever, is it wasn't a big enough thing to draw from, to justify, going back to that wellspring. And I don't think I agree. I mean, the first movie was objectively an enormous success. I think at the time it was one of the biggest films of that variety that had ever been made.
Right.
And I don't think you can really deny the legacy, whether or not you think it's shit. There are plenty of things that I would never watch that I'm aware of are enormously popular. Harry Potter, for example. I can't just say, oh, that's objectively a bad thing and it doesn't deserve its fan base. It has its own issues. But I think that the phrase unearned nostalgia is probably you could level it against the reboot in the sense that the reboot was trying to put its own spin on it in a way that a Spider-Verse type multiverse thing can happen because Spider-Man's been around forever. There have been so many iterations of it. It's so taken to the world's bosom over a very long period of time. But Ghostbusters never did that. It had the movies, it had the cartoon, and then 20 years later, a video game that was pretty good.
Yeah.
And, it didn't have comics that it had comics, but it didn't have very particularly famous comics or ones that, spun off into massive, complex, multi-iteration. It just didn't have that sprawling quality that I think another type of movie or another franchise can have, and you could do a reboot where it's completely different characters and get away with it.
Yeah.
And even with Ninja Turtles, which is a huge, huge thing by comparison, I think it's, even though the movies aren't as beloved, maybe, I'm not really sure, but in terms of how much it extends out, tendrils, there are so many different versions of it. You can do a film that's pretty removed from the original premise, with the animated film that came out a couple of years ago.
Yes,
that Seth Rogen did. I thought that was pretty good. But when the Michael Bay was doing his, he was initially going to be like, oh, they're not going to be mutant turtles anymore. They're going to be aliens from outer space. And everyone was like, no, they're not. I was like, okay, so there's a line, I think, for every sort of franchise that you can't cross. And he did roll back on that.
There's going to be a running theme in this podcast series, I think, of anti-Bayism. Because that's not the first time his name's come up and negative.
I've seen bits of those films on TV. It's so antithetical to what I would consider entertainment.
So as I segue into my final question for you, like a professional that I am, I was going to bring up the theme tune, and I thought it was a masterstroke. I thought of the guy of when they made the show of keeping the theme tune because it was so familiar. I think if they hadn't had the theme tune and they hadn't had the characters that didn't look like people in the film, I'm not sure how I would have embraced it so much. But the question that I'm asking every one of my guests is, what are your top 3 TV theme tunes from the classic kids shows that you watched when you were a child? which whenever I ask this question, people look the same way that you did just then. I think it is a really difficult question, but some people have just gone, straight away, whoosh, this.
Yeah.
But I've
They
struggled.
have to be animated?
No, it doesn't have to be animated, just classic kids' TV shows.
I mean, there were definitely some that were bangers. I mean, the Ninja Turtles theme tune
Yeah,
was pretty, like, that when that got into your brain, you
yeah.
know, that stayed there.
Splinter taught them to be ninja teens. He's a radical rat.
But yeah, no, that one slaps. I mean, I did really like probably the Ghostbusters would be another one. Like for the same kind of reason. I mean, I always preferred the movie version because it was a fuller sounding song. It's
Yeah,
kind of hard, but
yes.
from a production perspective, it was a bit more.
That's right.
I don't know. The TV version was a bit reedy, a bit thin. I found out actually something that was in the book that I found out kind of interesting was because Ray Parker Jr. doesn't sing the TV version.
Right.
And again, I'm not sure why they weren't able to just use the original version because it's basically beat for beat the same song.
Yeah.
But no, they re-recorded it, redid all the instrumentation, and the guy singing it is Carl Anderson, who isn't a name that immediately I'm like, oh, that guy. But I looked up who he was, and he was Judas in the movie version of Jesus Christ Superstar,
Okay.
which I must have watched like 20 times as a kid. For some reason, I really loved that musical. So that was kind of a bit of a mind-blowing moment because he to me is the definitive Judas. He's he nails it. Pardon the pun. Really, really powerful sort of soulful voice. And I actually, for a very long time, it was a revelation, I think, to find out that there are people who think of Judas as like, redhead.
Right.
Because to me, Judas is Carl Anderson,
Yeah.
which is not, he's not a redhead
Right.
by any stretch of the imagination. I knew he had records and stuff like that, but I wasn't really familiar with him by name. But there was kind of an interesting sort of two childhood things kind of converging. Third theme tune would be, as bad as it was, I did quite like the theme tune to that Little Shop of Horrors show.
Okay.
It was kind of, I think they were trying to do a sort of Fresh Prince of Bel-Air thing.
Now when you come to the shop, what you get and what you see, so just be careful. Getting close to me. Little shop. Take me to the little shop. I wanna go to the little shop. Word, little shop.
It's like you said about that earlier. They are the earworms, and you hear them so often. It's like, for me, it's D'Artagnan and Willy Fogg, 80 Days Around the World. They were some of them were terrible songs, but back then they were in your head for hours after the show.
I've got it.
Go on.
Not like number one, but as far as a song that will get in your brain and not leave you alone until you go nuts. Thomas the Tank Engine, shrill, sort of honky tonk synth piano, and the drum beat behind it. That very sort of like, very almost at odds with the premise of the show. Like, and also something almost sinister about it. I think that's one that really kind of got me as a kid. Maybe the Muppet Show.
Oh yeah, the Muppet Show. I love the Muppets. If I ever did a show just myself talking about what I love, the Muppet Show would probably be number one. I think I learned to draw because of the Muppets. My mother would just sit and draw the Muppets with me all day when I was 3 or 4. I'm gonna end it there, and that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Ben, for your time, and you and knowledge. And I hope this won't be the last time you come, because I can imagine, well, I know there's other shows you can talk about. And
Well, it was a pleasure. It was really nice.
I
And
really enjoyed that.
yeah, I think a lot of the shows on YouTube, if it's inspired anyone to go watch it. But yeah, no, thanks for having me.
And that's it for today's Blast from the Past. A massive thanks to Ben for guesting, and also to you for joining us on the Square Window. If you had fun time travelling with us, hit follow or subscribe wherever you listen. And if you really want to make our day, please leave us a 5-star review so that more people can find the show. Please come and join the Facebook community group, where I add additional content and further info on the shows we talk about. The links will be in the show description. So thanks for joining, and I'll catch you later on the next trip through the Square Window.